Tales Beyond Sleep. Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. Early life and childhood. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. His early life was marked not by opportunity, but by isolation, control, and a deeply toxic family environment that would shape his mind in disturbing ways. Ed was the second son of George and Augusta Gein, and while his father struggled with alcoholism and instability, his mother ruled the family with an iron grip. Augusta Gein was a domineering and fanatically religious woman. She preached constantly about sin, immorality, and the evils of women except herself. To her, the world was a place of temptation and corruption. She believed her sons, Henry and Ed, had to be shielded from society. She insisted they live in isolation, away from neighbors and peers, to prevent them from being tainted by the outside world. Her word was law in the Gein household, and she was merciless in enforcing it. The family eventually moved to a remote farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin, a location that would later become infamous. The farm was isolated, and Augusta used that seclusion to control her sons completely. They were allowed to leave only for school and occasional errands. Friendships were discouraged, and social connections were cut off. The boys' lives revolved around their mother's teachings, strict rules, endless lectures about sin, and constant reminders that the outside world was evil. Ed grew up shy, awkward, and withdrawn. At school, he was quiet and often the target of bullies. His odd mannerisms, soft voice, and lack of hygiene made him stand out, and he rarely defended himself. Teachers noticed he seemed detached, staring into space or laughing to himself at inappropriate times. Despite his strangeness, he did reasonably well in class, particularly in reading. But while other children played and socialized, Ed went home to a life of suffocating isolation. His father, George, contributed little stability. He was abusive at times, unable to hold steady work, and drank heavily. Henry, Ed's older brother, grew resentful of Augusta's control and later tried to push back against her teachings. But Ed clung to his mother, idolizing her to a disturbing degree. Augusta was the center of his world. Her disapproval crushed him, and her rare moments of affection gave him a sense of validation he craved. This attachment created a dependency that would last long after her death. During these years, seeds of obsession were planted in Ed's mind. Augusta filled his head with ideas about the wickedness of women and the dangers of sexuality. She constantly told him that women were instruments of sin, not to be trusted or desired. These beliefs became fused with Ed's fragile psyche, warping his ability to view people, especially women, in any normal, healthy way. As a teenager, Ed became fascinated with macabre subjects. He read pulp magazines, anatomy books, and medical journals when he could find them. He showed a disturbing interest in death and the human body. While these interests might have been harmless curiosities in another child, in Ed's isolated and distorted environment, they grew into something far darker. He began to see death not as a mystery, but as something to explore, something he could control. By the time Ed reached adulthood, his life experience was painfully limited. He had never dated, never traveled, and never lived independently. His world was confined to his mother, his brother, and the Plainfield farm. To outsiders, he was strange but quiet, a man to be pitied rather than feared. No one could have imagined that behind his awkward demeanor and blank expression, a darkness was slowly forming. A darkness that would one day horrify the world. The story of Ed Gein was only just beginning, and when it unfolded, it would shock not only his small town of Plainfield, but also inspire some of the most terrifying characters in horror history. By the early 1940s, the Gein household had grown even more unstable. Ed's father, George, was consumed by alcoholism. He rarely worked, and his violent temper made life at home tense. In 1940, George died of heart failure caused by years of heavy drinking. While his death brought little emotional impact to Ed, it was the first fracture in the small world Augusta had built. With George gone, Henry, Ed's older brother, began to openly question their mother's teachings. Henry worried about Ed's unhealthy devotion to Augusta. He encouraged Ed to break away, to consider life outside their mother's suffocating control. Henry even started dating a woman, something Augusta despised. This tension created a divide between the brothers. Henry was seeking independence while Ed clung tighter to his mother's influence. In 1944, tragedy struck in a way that remains suspicious to this day. Ed and Henry were burning brush on the farm when the fire grew out of control. Local firefighters were called, and when the flames were extinguished, Henry was found dead. The official cause was listed as heart failure, possibly brought on by smoke inhalation, but details raised questions. Henry's body was discovered in an area that hadn't been burned, and he reportedly had bruises on his head. Rumors spread that Ed may have had something to do with his brother's death, though no charges were ever filed. Whether accidental or not, Henry's death removed the last obstacle between Ed and his mother. Now it was just Ed and Augusta. But even that would not last. In late 1945, Augusta suffered a series of strokes. Ed cared for her devotedly, tending to her every need, but her health continued to decline. In December of that year, Augusta died at the age of 67. For most people, the death of a parent is a painful but natural part of life. For Ed, it was catastrophic. His entire world had revolved around her. She had been his moral compass, his authority, and the only human connection he truly valued. With her gone, Ed was utterly alone. After Augusta's death, Ed's life changed dramatically. He boarded up the rooms his mother had used, leaving them preserved like a shrine. The parlor, the sitting room, and Augusta's bedroom were sealed off, untouched and meticulously kept clean. Ed confined himself to just a few small areas of the farmhouse, the kitchen and a tiny room next to it. The rest of the house fell into decay. Dust collected, garbage piled up, and the farmhouse slowly transformed into a dark, filthy cave that mirrored Ed's unraveling mind. Isolated on the farm, Ed took odd jobs around Plainfield. Locals saw him as peculiar but harmless. He worked as a handyman, occasionally babysat children, and even did small tasks for neighbors. He was known for his quiet demeanor and strange laughter, often chuckling to himself at odd moments. Townspeople pitied him more than they feared him. Beneath the surface, however, his mind was slipping deeper into darkness. Loneliness consumed him. With no family, no close friends, and no social connections, Ed began retreating into a world of fantasy. He became obsessed with pulp magazines that focused on crime, death, and the macabre. He collected medical books, anatomy manuals, and articles about headhunters, cannibals, and Nazi atrocities. These weren't just passing curiosities. Ed studied them, feeding his imagination with gruesome ideas. At the same time, he began visiting local cemeteries. Driven by grief and obsession, he admitted later that he hoped to reconnect with his mother in some way. He began exhuming recently buried bodies of women who reminded him of Augusta. At first, he claimed he simply wanted to visit them, to sit with them in the moonlight. But soon he took their remains home. He experimented with bones, organs, and skin, crafting disturbing objects that blurred the line between the living and the dead. This period of isolation was the turning point in Ed Gein's life. With his mother gone and no one to guide or restrain him, his delusions grew unchecked. The quiet, awkward handyman of Plainfield was transforming into something monstrous. The farmhouse was no longer just his home. It was becoming a workshop of horrors, a place where Ed's fantasies would take terrifying physical form. And soon the people of Plainfield would discover just how dark those fantasies had become. By the mid-1950s, Ed Gein's obsession with death had consumed his life. His farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin had become a grotesque museum of his fantasies. While most of the house remained boarded up in a shrine-like state to his late mother, the areas where Ed lived told a much darker story. Inside, investigators would later find piles of clutter, decaying trash, and beneath it all objects no one could have imagined. But before those discoveries shocked the world, Ed committed acts that forever stained his name in history. Though he was long suspected of grave robbing, it wasn't until he turned to murder that his crimes became known. On November 16, 1957, Ed walked into a local hardware store owned by 58-year-old Bernice Worden. She was a respected member of the community and well-liked around town. That morning, her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, had gone hunting. When he returned later in the day, the store was deserted. Bernice was gone, the cash register was empty, and there were bloodstains on the floor. A receipt found in the store showed that Ed Gein had been the last customer. Suspicion immediately fell on the quiet, peculiar handyman. Police went to Gein's farmhouse that evening. What they found inside was beyond anything they could have prepared for. In a shed on the property, Bernice Worden's body was discovered, mutilated, and hung like an animal being prepared for butchering. The discovery stunned even the most seasoned officers. But that was only the beginning. As investigators searched the farmhouse, the true extent of Ed Gein's depravity was revealed. Inside, they found human skulls used as bowls, chairs upholstered with human skin, masks made from faces carefully preserved, and even a belt crafted from human nipples. In one drawer were lips fashioned into a crude decoration. In a box, investigators found preserved female heads. The farmhouse was filled with nightmarish creations, stitched together in ways that defied comprehension. These objects were not the result of a moment of madness. They were the work of years of obsession. It was later discovered that Ed had been making frequent trips to local cemeteries, digging up the bodies of recently buried women. He admitted to robbing graves and taking parts home to fashion into what he described as keepsakes. But more disturbingly, Ed confessed to wanting to create a suit of female skin, something that would allow him to become his mother, to literally climb into her image and keep her alive in some twisted form. His devotion to Augusta had mutated into something monstrous. Investigators also linked him to another missing woman, Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had vanished in 1954. Her face was later found among Ed's grotesque collection, confirming she too had been a victim. Though Gein admitted to killing both Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, he remained evasive about the details. Whether he had more victims is still debated, though many believe he may have killed others whose disappearances were never solved. The horrors of Ed Gein's farmhouse spread quickly through the small town of Plainfield. Locals were horrified to learn that the strange but seemingly harmless man who did odd jobs and babysat children was living in a nightmare world of death and desecration. Rumors swirled, and the story quickly caught national attention. Newspapers labeled him the Butcher of Plainfield, while others called him a ghoul, and eventually the man who inspired some of horror's most terrifying characters. What police uncovered at the Gein farm went far beyond murder. It was a glimpse into a mind warped by loneliness, obsession, and delusion. A man whose grief for his mother twisted into a compulsion to control death itself. The farmhouse became infamous, a symbol of unspeakable horror that would haunt Plainfield for decades. And while Ed Gein's crimes shocked the town, his trial and the question of his sanity would soon shock the entire nation. The arrest of Ed Gein in November 1957 sent shockwaves across Wisconsin and the entire United States. Newspapers were filled with lurid headlines, describing the grisly discoveries at his farmhouse in Plainfield. For a community that had long regarded Ed as a quiet, odd, but harmless handyman, the truth was almost impossible to accept. How could this shy, soft-spoken man have been responsible for such unimaginable horrors? Once in custody, Ed was subjected to long hours of questioning. He spoke with little emotion, often in a matter-of-fact tone as if what he had done was perfectly rational. He admitted to robbing graves, fashioning objects from body parts, and killing 2 women, Mary Hogan in 1954 and Bernice Worden in 1957. Yet despite the confessions, Ed often seemed detached from the reality of his crimes. He described them as though he were recounting everyday chores, not acts that horrified the world. Psychiatrists were immediately brought in to evaluate Ed's mental state. Their findings revealed a man deeply disturbed. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, severe psychosis, and sexual perversion, though he denied ever having intercourse with his victims. Instead, he claimed his actions stemmed from a compulsion to be close to his mother again. He admitted to wanting to create a woman suit from the skin of the dead, so he could literally climb inside and become Augusta. His obsession with her was so powerful that even in death, she remained the center of his twisted world. The legal question quickly became not just whether Ed Gein was guilty, but whether he was sane enough to stand trial. In January 1958, he was found incompetent and committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. For more than a decade, he remained there, receiving treatment and medication. His demeanor in the hospital was eerily calm. Nurses and staff described him as polite, cooperative, even childlike at times. To those who didn't know his past, he seemed like an unthreatening patient. But beneath the surface was the memory of what he had done, preserved in photographs, police reports, and the haunted minds of Plainfield residents. In 1968, doctors determined Ed was competent to stand trial. By this point, the public had been living with his story for over a decade, and the trial became a media spectacle. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, desperate to glimpse the man who had inspired nightmares. The trial was relatively short, focusing almost entirely on his mental state. His defense argued insanity, while prosecutors emphasized his deliberate actions. Ultimately, the judge ruled Ed guilty of murder but legally insane. He was sentenced to life in a mental institution rather than prison. Throughout the proceedings, Ed's demeanor never changed. He sat quietly, rarely showing emotion. He did not fight the charges or display anger toward the court. Instead, he seemed resigned, almost passive, as if he didn't fully grasp the enormity of his crimes. To many, that detachment was the most chilling part of all. It was as though the horrors he had committed existed in a separate reality inside his mind, a place where his actions made sense to him, but to no one else. The farmhouse, meanwhile, became a grim point of fascination. Locals wanted it destroyed, believing it to be cursed, while outsiders were morbidly curious to see the place where the atrocities had occurred. In March 1958, before it could be sold at auction, the farmhouse mysteriously burned to the ground. Arson was suspected, but no culprit was ever identified. To the people of Plainfield, the fire was a relief. The nightmare house was gone, though the memory of what had been inside would never fade. Ed Gein spent the remainder of his life in mental institutions. He lived quietly, often working in the hospital yard or kitchen, reading, and occasionally speaking with staff and visitors. To many, it was unsettling how ordinary he seemed, a man who had done monstrous things now behaving like a model patient. But the photographs, the police reports, and the missing lives of his victims told the real story. The trial of Ed Gein did not bring closure. Instead, it left behind a chilling reminder. Evil does not always appear monstrous on the outside. Sometimes it hides behind a quiet face, a nervous smile, and a soft-spoken voice. Ed Gein's death in 1984 from respiratory failure marked the end of his life, but not the end of his story. In many ways, his crimes have lived on far longer than the man himself. His legacy is not measured in the small number of confirmed victims, 2 women, but in the cultural impact his story had on American society, law enforcement, and popular culture. To this day, the name Ed Gein remains synonymous with terror. In Plainfield, Wisconsin, the shadow of Ed Gein still lingers. Residents who lived through the 1950s never forgot the shock of discovering what had been hiding in their community. For them, the Gein case was not a distant horror tale, it was personal. Families who had buried loved ones wondered if their graves had been desecrated. Neighbors who had once hired Ed for odd jobs grappled with the knowledge that they had invited him into their homes. The farmhouse, burned down in 1958, became a symbol of the town's desire to erase the memory. Yet tourists and outsiders continued to pass through, drawn by a morbid curiosity that frustrated locals who wanted to move on. In law enforcement and psychiatry, the case became a study in criminal psychology. Ed was seen as an example of how isolation, mental illness, and obsessive attachments can twist into violence when left unchecked. His dependency on his mother, combined with untreated schizophrenia and disturbing fantasies, created a deadly mix. Investigators also saw the case as proof that appearances could be deceiving. Ed was quiet, polite, even helpful around town, yet he harbored secrets that shocked the world. But where Ed Gein's influence spread most was in the realm of horror. His crimes inspired a wave of terrifying fictional characters that continue to haunt audiences. Robert Bloch's 1959 novel, Psycho, and Alfred Hitchcock's film adaptation drew heavily from Gein's story. Norman Bates, the polite, soft-spoken motel owner devoted to his domineering mother, was a direct reflection of Ed's relationship with Augusta. In the 1970s, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre introduced Leatherface, a killer who wore masks made of human skin and lived in a house filled with grotesque trophies. That imagery came straight from the horrors of the Gein farmhouse. Later, The Silence of the Lambs presented Buffalo Bill, who skinned his victims to create a woman suit, another disturbing echo of Gein's fantasies. These cultural legacies turned Ed Gein into more than just a criminal. He became a figure of legend. While other serial killers claimed far more victims, Gein's crimes were so bizarre and macabre that they carved a permanent place in horror history. He blurred the line between reality and fiction, inspiring characters who terrify audiences to this day. Yet it is important to remember that behind the legend were real lives lost. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden were not fictional characters. They were women whose lives were stolen, whose families were shattered, and whose names are often overshadowed by the infamy of their killer. The sensational aspects of the Gein case, the masks, the furniture, the farmhouse, captured the public's imagination, but the true tragedy lies in the victims. Today, Ed Gein remains one of the most infamous criminals in American history. His story is retold in documentaries, books, and films, each revisiting the chilling details of Plainfield. For some, his tale is a cautionary reminder of untreated mental illness and unchecked isolation. For others, it is the spark that ignited an entire genre of horror storytelling. The legacy of Ed Gein is twofold: a grim reality of pain and loss in a small Wisconsin town, and a lasting cultural myth that continues to terrify. More than 60 years after his arrest, the Butcher of Plainfield still casts a long shadow, proving that sometimes the most horrifying monsters are not those in movies, but the ones that once lived quietly among us. Tales Beyond Sleep. The mystery never truly ends, and your support helps me keep uncovering these stories. Please like, follow, and subscribe. It really helps me out and lets me share more chilling tales with you. Thank you.